Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast number 125. I'm Jim Cornell and this is the weekly podcast from Labiotech. This week, on our first podcast of 2025, the subject is biotech's role in developing new non-opioid pain treatments. Brixton Biosciences is a clinical stage life sciences company spun out from Massachusetts General Brigham. It was recently awarded $2 million from the NIH HEAL Initiative to support the development of the company's non-opioid injectable pain relief solutions. And so our guest on the podcast this week is Sameer Sabir, CEO and co-founder of Brixton Biosciences, to dive deeper into pain medication and Brixton's mission. To get things started, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about Brixton Biosciences.
Sure. Brixton was founded in 2019, but originates from work done at the Mass General Hospital here in Boston, which is part of the Harvard Medical School teaching network. And in the lab as an academic project, this started in around 2012, funded primarily by funding from the DoD to really look at ways to manage pain in alternative ways. And over the course of several years at this very translational lab, they're very good at actually thinking about technologies in the context of how they're ultimately going to be used in patients, as well as just the basic science. They brought the technology to a point where we spun it out in 2019 into Brixton, raised a Series A, which essentially allowed us to develop a product, do some clinical work to demonstrate proof of concept for the approach. Yeah, brings us to where we are today, which is on the threshold of going into a pivotal regulatory study with FDA.
I guess all steps along the way from setting up the company right the way through to commercialization, a long journey.
The lab did such excellent work in validating the basic science, proving the principle of the premise, but ultimately, that's sort of where they, I think, almost see the project as being complete, as it were. And that's where our work begins, which is really sort of turning technology into a product, productizing something and then validating it is sort of the next journey. And the next journey after that is actually going out into the market and selling it. And so that's the next iteration.
That's right. And then you have to start over again with the next. Do you have a big pipeline or?
So Neural Ice, which is the Brixton product, it's a platform. Ultimately, we want to see this as a product that's as ubiquitous as lidocaine in terms of the way that it's used. It's an ultra long-acting nerve block from our perspective, a drug-free ultra long-acting nerve block. We're starting out looking at the musculoskeletal system and specifically at the knee. Our first indication is going to be in patients who have chronic pain from osteoarthritis of the knee, and from the knee we'll go to the hip, from the hip we'll go to the next joint until we feel that we're at a point where we can have a discussion with FDA about a more general label, and then we'll see where we go from there. So pipeline, yes, but the technology is very similar across all of the different indications, which I think is kind of how it was set up by design in the beginning.
Obviously the US is different to the UK and problems are different in different countries, but we do hear a lot about the opioid crisis. I wonder if you could, before we talk about the things that you're working on, if you could explain a little bit about the background and the extent of that problem.
Yeah. I mean, much of this work stems from the opioid crisis. It's certainly not the only aspect to what we're doing. It is, or feels like, somewhat of a US-centric phenomenon, and really, I think, was triggered by, frankly, some fairly egregious practices in the pharmaceutical industry. And I think everyone has probably heard of the Purdue Pharma situation and OxyContin and how that was marketed in a way that wasn't necessarily appropriate back in 80s and 90s, and ultimately led to vast numbers of people being prescribed these very strong addictive painkillers for, often issues that could be managed without that kind of intervention. And it sort of mushroomed from there, from prescription medications to the influx of cheap synthetic opioids from overseas to sort of fuel the crisis, as it were, as people become addicted and require a way to be able to sustain that addiction beyond being able to receive prescriptions from their clinicians. So it's kind of gone from this situation that was created by practices in the pharmaceutical industry, prescribing patterns that were encouraged in the clinical community, to this sort of full-blown crisis of addiction, which I think in 2020 took 100,000 lives in the US just from overdoses. So it's a very serious issue and has torn apart homes, has torn apart communities. I've been to communities in sort of rural New England, for example, that have been decimated by the opioid crisis. And the impact of it is real world. I mean, it's actual loss of the ability to provide for families, loss of the ability to function independently for the individuals. And you can see how that translates to a societal effect. It's a very sad situation. And it was only in 2017 that it was actually recognized as a crisis by the federal government in the United States. And I will say that there's been sort of a wholesale change in the last decade or so in terms of the way that these medications are prescribed. They are obviously medications that are in certain cases still used and are necessary and required, but sort of the nuance in how that is done has become much more pronounced. So you're not going to walk into the doctor for some back pain now and walk out with a bottle full of Vicodin, which is an opioid. I had my wisdom teeth taken out, I think 15 years ago, and just after I moved to the US, and walked out of the dentist's office with a prescription for 30 opioid pills, which is more than enough to get me through the pain from having my wisdom teeth removed, and also more than enough to get me addicted and in real trouble. And actually, one of the reasons why I got really interested in this technology was that I had a friend whose father-in-law was a pastor, had colorectal cancer, had surgery. The cancer was cured, but he got addicted to opioids from the pain from the cancer surgery and died a year or two later, which was very striking to me. So it's a real serious issue. It takes real lives. It has real impact on communities. It's kind of gone beyond the point where I think prescription of opioids by clinicians is the only issue anymore. There's much more of a sort of illicit drug use component to it now as well. That said, there is a causal link between its use in the medical community and sort of the impact that it's had. And I think this originated, sadly, in part in our industry. And I think it's incumbent on our industry to do what we can to provide better alternatives for patients so that they don't suffer from the horrifying consequences of addiction.
I guess people see drugs as an urban, young people issue, but clearly with prescription drugs, it really knows no boundaries.
Yeah, I think of them as unwitting victims. If I'm in my 60s or 70s and I go to the doctor because I have some pain in my wrist and I get given an opioid and suddenly I'm addicted to opioids, I didn't want to be. Many folks have ended up in that situation, and that's kind of the tragedy of it. And I think we're past the point of trying to pin blame on how it started and why it started and who was responsible. I think most of that has become pretty clear over the years. And at this point, beyond accountability for victims and justice for victims, I'm not sure it really matters that much going forward. And our energies at least are better spent focusing on what can we do to figure out an alternative that is much more helpful to patients.
I know that obviously you can buy over-the-counter pain relief medication, sure, but obviously that isn't capable of dealing with high-end pain. Are there any current alternatives to opioids for the severe pain?
It's a great question, and maybe I'll sort of answer that by breaking down with some generalization how I see pain therapies in general in terms of buckets or categories. And there are certain, you can buy paracetamol, Tylenol, ibuprofen at the pharmacy, and those products are reasonably effective for most aches and pains, but like you said, don't necessarily have the strength to address more serious issues. So there are several different prescription medications that are not opioids that are also effective for managing pain of various different classes, have been around for a long time. Stronger non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, for example, and things like gabapentin, which are neuromodulators. So there are definitely other alternatives available. They're systemic medications, right? So you pop a pill and they aren't necessarily targeted towards the specific pain that you're trying to get to. And then you have injectables, right? So local anesthetics like lidocaine, bupivacaine, and so on and so forth that you inject in the area that you have the pain, and it blocks the pain for a certain period of time. With the systemics, you need to take pills regularly in order to maintain the pain relief with the local anesthetics. They work really well, but they don't work for a particularly long time. From a standard shot of lidocaine, for example, you may get several hours of pain relief. And with some of the more newfangled products in that category, maybe you get a day and a bit of pain relief. And then the third bucket of therapies are, in my mind, interventions. So it's not a pill, it's not an injection, it's more of a procedure. And they generally fall into the ablative category. And what we mean by ablative is that they are procedures that use tools to actually ablate or damage or destroy the nerve that is conducting the pain signal. And that tends to be a longer lasting solution when it works, but the when it works piece is important. There are a whole class of products known as ablative tools. They're typically probes that either heat up to very hot or very cold temperatures. And the goal is to try and touch the nerve with that probe. And with that, you do a form of reversible damage to the nerve. Typically, you ablate the nerve so it sort of undergoes a degeneration and it comes back over time, but that time could be 6 months or so. And that's the period during which the patient experiences relief. But if you can imagine how small and thin and hard to find some nerves are, and then trying to hit that nerve with the tip of a pin, it's not an easy thing to do, even when we're employing imaging modalities like fluoroscopy or ultrasound and so on and so forth. So there are a number of different alternatives available to manage pain, and pain itself is also a very heterogeneous term. There are many, many different types of pain, and many of them require different types of interventions. So I think there's never going to be such a thing as a panacea for the treatment of pain. I think that's the first thing that we all need to understand. There is a lot of room for innovation in the space because many of these approaches have been around for a long time, and there are many different types of pain to target.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, you run into issues such as not just the addiction issue, but the fact that quite often after a certain period of time, it starts to lose its effectiveness. And also you have the issue of you're addressing the pain, but you're not necessarily issuing the reason for the pain.
Yeah. And that's why opioids were great as a way to mask all of that in a way. You just throw something at a problem that it overpowers it, overwhelms it, and the patient feels great for a while, and then the real issues kind of come to light. You're right. There are many different factors to this, and managing pain requires not just good therapies, but also a thinking clinician in order to be effective.
Could you tell me a bit about how neural ice was developed and how it all works?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating story, actually. This technology was developed at the Wellman Center for Photomedicine at Mass General Hospital, and the inventor is a very prolific scientist, clinician, inventor here in the Boston area called Professor Rox Anderson, who has been responsible for many innovations in the medical space, including laser hair removal, for example. He invented in the 90s. He's a dermatologist by training, but is very broad in his reach in terms of the work that he's done. He invented a technology called cool sculpting back in 2008, which is a very widely used approach to remove fat non-invasively for aesthetic purposes. However, what they noticed in the early work in those patients was that the way that cool sculpting works is you take fat like love handles or whatever and sandwich it between two plates that you then cool down. And what that does is it induces a process known as cryolipolysis in the fat cells, which basically means that the cooling induces the fat cells to undergo programmed cell death and dying. And what they noticed in these patients was that these patients were getting reduced sensation or numbness at the site where they received this treatment for long periods of time, months at a time, which is a little unusual if you think about it, because if you put an ice pack on a sprain, it brings the pain down for a period of time, but once you remove the ice pack, the pain comes back pretty quickly. So, in around 2010, Professor Anderson got very interested as to why these patients were experiencing this long-lasting loss of sensation and started investigating that in his lab alongside another scientist named Dr. Lila Goribian. Ultimately identified that nerves have what's known as a myelin sheath. Many nerves have what's known as a myelin sheath, which is essentially a fatty layer around the nerve that helps with conducting the signal that transmits pain or whatever else you're trying to transmit. And that these cooling processes were inducing this cryolipolysis in the cells in the myelin sheath around the nerve, and therefore dampening down the conductivity of the nerves. And it was a pretty interesting finding because it was completely incidental, almost perpendicular to the objective of that technology. It was an aesthetic medicine procedure that resulted in this really interesting finding that ultimately will lead to be part of the solution for pain. And they started playing around with, I shouldn't say playing around, they started investigating how this could potentially be used to treat things like cutaneous pain and itch, issues where nerves are close to the surface of the skin and you can get to them just by cooling topically. But they progressed pretty quickly to essentially trying to understand how to inject cold around nerves to be able to target nerves anywhere in the body and trigger this process. So that was the technology that Brixton was founded around and inherited, was essentially the ability to be able to inject cold around the nerve, i.e., therefore neural ice. And the product itself is very simple in the sense that it is a sterile prefilled syringe that comes with a material already in the syringe that is frozen before use and then is injected frozen. And all of the components of the formulation are excipients. They are inactive ingredients, and the mechanism of action is purely physical. So you inject this material around the nerve and it induces this process of cryolipolysis of the lipid-rich tissue in the myelin sheath, which then triggers this dampening down or degeneration of the nerve that eventually comes back over time. But like the ablative approaches, it lasts for much, much longer than traditional injection. And our goal up front was really to try and make this as simple and familiar and easy to use as a local anesthetic. So that was a big design consideration for us, was that this really should look, smell, feel like a local anesthetic as much as possible, so that there's not a big barrier to adoption. It's a new technology, but it's a familiar form factor and people know how to use it. But local anesthetics don't last very long. And so the objective of the technology was to give the durability of the ablative approaches without the complexity. So we're trying to marry up, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of second and third categories of therapies in this area, the local anesthetics, which are easy to use but don't last very long, and the ablative approaches that do last for long but are very difficult to use and often, therefore, aren't used correctly and don't work.
How often do you need to give the injection?
So our goal is that a single injection will provide 3 to 6 months of relief. Now, we are at the point where we've done one first-in-man study, and the data from that study has been really exciting, actually. It appears to be safe and it appears to be long-lasting. We're now entering into a large randomized controlled pivotal study in knee patients. We actually just enrolled our first patients this week in this study, which will be several hundred patients, which will give us a lot more information as to how effective this is in helping patients. But the aim is one shot for 3 to 6 months of relief, which if you're undergoing a surgical procedure, if we ultimately pursue surgical labels, that would be sort of one shot before surgery, and then hopefully, you're done. But for chronic pain, which is an area that we're very interested in, the goal would be to only have the patient have to come in once every several months for an injection. And in our clinical studies, these injections take less than 5 minutes. So this would be hopefully a very quick procedure, not akin to having some kind of a surgical procedure.
You mentioned that you're starting with knees. Is it something that will be suitable for all different kinds of pain and for different levels of pain, or do you envisage it just being for kind of severe pain?
No. I mean, let's take a knee patient as an example for a second. When a knee patient presents with knee pain from osteoarthritis, the first intervention is usually PT, ibuprofen, and so on and so forth. But the first real intervention is a steroid shot. And that steroid shot, the first steroid shot can provide some relief from the pain, not by targeting the pain directly, but by targeting the inflammation from the osteoarthritis. But subsequent steroid shots start to get more and more dangerous for the patient because they can degenerate cartilage. So you can give these patients maybe 1 or 2 steroid shots, and then, what comes after that? There are hyaluronic acid products that try and create a buffer in the space in the knee that are widely used but are not particularly effective. And then there are these ablative tools to try to kill the pain when it gets very severe. And then there's a total knee replacement, which is a surgical procedure. And even after a total knee replacement, 20% of patients continue to suffer chronic pain. So basically, after that first steroid shot, all the way through to after the patient has had a total knee replacement and is still experiencing chronic pain, there aren't really any good options for patients to manage this pain. And we think that this is something that could fit throughout that entire continuum after that first steroid shot, where the pain is often not severe. We obviously need to prove that out through good clinical studies over time, but this is not going to replace ibuprofen or paracetamol, but it could certainly replace that first intervention that patients have before things get too crazy, and continue to help the patient as they sort of progress. As you said earlier, just because we're helping with the pain, we're not fixing the underlying problem either, and we need to be mindful of that. So if a patient needs a knee replacement because they're bone on bone, they need a knee replacement. But often a patient who is 45 doesn't necessarily want to have a knee replacement at 45 and wants to find a way to be able to delay that surgery for 5 years, 10 years. And so there are many different aspects as to how this could be used in the long term. But, we sort of dream big, but we focus on proving out one thing at a time. And so that's the approach we're taking.
How quickly does it take effect?
In our early clinical work, we see a onset time of, 3 to 5 days. And it's because the mechanism of action is really a physical mechanism of action here versus a biochemical mechanism of action. So it takes a bit of time for the induction of the cryolipolysis and so on and so forth. But it's pretty consistent in that time frame. And actually that tacks back pretty well to all of the preclinical animal work that was done, similar timeline for onset of action. So a few days.
Are there any side effects associated with this treatment?
Not really. Nothing that has caused us any concern. It's a painful injection, the particular injection that we're doing in this first study. We're targeting the genicular nerves around the knee, which are very close to the periosteum, which is very sensitive to touch. So sometimes if the needle touches the periosteum, it could be a little uncomfortable for the patient during the procedure. But that was really the biggest issue that we saw. And that's unfortunately the case, whatever type of approach you try and use to target that nerve. But in terms of the product or the material itself, as I mentioned earlier, it consists entirely of excipients, which are by nature inactive ingredients that shouldn't have any safety concerns. They're all on the FDA's generally regarded as safe list, the GRAS list. We felt as if this approach would be the approach that maintained the cleanest safety profile for patients. Obviously, we need to prove that out in studies and so on and so forth. But so far, so good. We're happy with the safety profile from the early data.
Could you maybe go over the difference between the use of opioids and non-opioids for treatment of pain?
Opioids aren't really used as much in the treatment of chronic pain as they were in the height of the opioid crisis. So it's become common practice now to use non-opioid based systemic medications to try and help these patients. And systemic medications by their nature affect every cell in the body. And so they are very appropriate and very relevant in certain types of pain. So for example, this is kind of my view, if a patient has a crush injury or has been in a car accident or has diffuse injury that's causing pain, there's no alternative really to a systemic medication. However, when you have the understanding and the ability to be able to target a nerve that you know is transmitting pain, why not target that nerve and provide pain relief to the patient without having to take a pill that affects every cell in the body? That's kind of the basic philosophy behind not just what we're doing, but also behind the local anesthetic approach, right? Regional anesthesia. Target the nerve specifically so you don't have to target the entire body. The problem with that approach historically has been that those products just don't last very long. So if we have an approach that now does last orders of magnitude longer, in certain instances, that makes more sense than popping a pill. So I think the more apt discussion is sort of mapping out what makes sense to treat regionally and what makes sense to treat, more globally in terms of how pain is treated these patients.
People seem to have different pain thresholds and different reactions to pain. Are there different reactions to neural ice?
There absolutely is. And that is because pain is a very individual thing. It's partly physical and it's partly central, right? It's partly psychological. Our goal, as with most other pain therapies, honestly, is to try and provide patients with 50% of relief if you base it on a rating system. So if a patient has pain that's at 7 out of 10, we want to get them down to 3 to 4 out of 10. That's the difference between severe pain and mild pain. That could be the difference between being able to walk down the stairs and not walk down the stairs. So each patient is almost their own control. So yes, they do react differently. Every individual has a different perception of pain, but they can benchmark that against their own experiences. And so as long as we can provide that patient with a benefit that they feel is markedly different, that's really kind of what's important. And it's kind of one of the reasons why clinical studies in this space are so difficult to design and to execute, because of that, and also because of the placebo effect from these therapies. It's a very interesting and challenging question to be able to design good clinical studies that really sort of capture exactly what you just said.
So does that mean that you have to change doses at all?
Our goal is to essentially target the nerve in question and to damp it down. And so we're using a standardized dose in this first study. And I think that's part of the benefit of our mechanism of action being physical and not biochemical, metabolic, and so on and so forth. There's no real concept of it's too much, like from a drug standpoint, you're taking too much. This material ultimately breaks down, melts, and is absorbed by the body within a day. And the sort of the cold action is gone within about 10 minutes. So we're starting out with a one-size-fits-all approach in a defined category of patients. But the whole point of that is also to learn, right? So that may not be where we ultimately end up. We're certainly still in the clinical trial phase, and so are working to learn and to understand, as well as to get to a point where we can take this to market.
Speaking of market, when you go into a pharmacy or to a drugstore, you get that over-the-counter pain medication that's extremely cheap. What's the cost effectiveness, I guess, of Neuralize? How does it compare?
Yeah, there's nothing particularly complicated or expensive about the material. So we should be able to manufacture this very efficiently and be able to drive much more drug-like margins than the typical medical device. Technically, we will be regulated as a device, even though our product is an injectable, but we hope to have more drug-like margins. In terms of how expensive it will be to the end user or to the consumer, that will probably vary based on whether this is in the US or in Europe or Canada and elsewhere in the world where pricing systems are so different. But what we hope is that this is not a technology that we're developing to be used in a small subset of patients. This is something that we ultimately want to see as ubiquitous as lidocaine and other local anesthetics. And so by that very statement, we expect this to be a cost-effective solution that can be deployed very, very broadly, is our fervent goal.
Are there other companies working on, not the same thing that you're working on, but are there other companies working on alternatives to opioid treatments?
There are, yeah, thankfully. And by the way, I think we welcome any and all attempts and programs to address this, frankly, pretty horrific situation, at least here in the US, when it comes to the opioid crisis, and also address the fact that in an aging population, managing pain effectively becomes, ever more important. So there are a number of companies, both big and small, that are working on different approaches to treating pain, including some of the largest biotechnology companies in the country, such as Vertex, who have a very interesting program with a sodium channel blocker, all the way down to startups that are working on various different approaches to repurpose existing products, such as lidocaine or bupivacaine, into modalities that might last a bit longer through, some form of extended release or other drug delivery mechanism. And they're all important. Pain is not a panacea. And so I think that the fact that there are multiple different groups working on this problem is a great thing.
What are the challenges when it comes to developing non-opioid pain relief treatments?
I think the challenge with any pain treatment is doing a good clinical study that actually demonstrates that it's doing something. A big factor in pain and in pain studies is the placebo effect, kind of the equivalent of your mom giving you a sugar pill when you were a kid, and that made you feel that something was happening and that you got better, but it was a sugar pill. And you see the same thing in pain. It's kind of interesting how when a patient thinks they're getting a treatment, it actually gives them some benefit for a period of time. So teasing out whether your product is actually having a real impact on that pain or whether it's just a placebo effect that the patient is experiencing kind of gets to the heart of designing a clinical study in this field. And that's probably the trickiest part of doing studies in pain in general. In terms of the opioid specific piece, because our product is injectable and single use almost, as it were, one shot for months of relief, I think the addiction aspect is kind of addressed by default because of that. I always find it very interesting when we think about systemic non-addictive medications, because it's probably possible to get addicted to anything. I mean, there are people addicted to Coca-Cola. There are people addicted to sour candies. Addiction is a very complex mechanism in the first place. So I imagine that for those products, the challenge in the studies that they need to do is to show that just because you're not hitting an opioid receptor, does that really mean that you're not creating any addiction issues? So there are many challenges to sort of doing good work in this space and getting to a good product, but they're the right challenges to be addressing, and you need to be able to show that you're addressing them, right? Otherwise, we'll just end up in the same place as we did a couple of decades ago.
Is there anything else that you're working on? Or I know you were saying that you're moving from the knee to different parts of the body, but is that really what you're concentrating on, or are there other things?
So within Brixton, our focus is on dream big, but focus and get, the first few things over the hump. And from there, the world is your oyster. So we're very interested in the knee. We're very interested in the hip, in the hand, other joints where a high number of patients experience pain because of diseases like osteoarthritis. But the reality is that we can target nerves anywhere in the body. And ultimately, we want to be able to target nerves anywhere in the body to provide pain relief. But there are also other functions that nerves have, as we know, that if you want to tamp them down could potentially have therapeutic benefits. So some of the things outside of pain that we've thought about just off the top of my head, and I'm making it very clear that we have no programs in these areas whatsoever. I think they're just interesting indications that we could potentially think about are things as diverse as cancer pain, overactive bladder, sleep apnea. I mean, there are many things that we can potentially address by targeting nerves, but we're going to walk before we can run.
What kind of timeline are you looking at for neural eyes?
Our hope is that we would be going to FDA in late 2026 for our first potential regulatory submission if all of our recruitment plans go somewhat according to plan in our clinical studies and so on and so forth.
Really interesting to hear about the issues with opioid drugs and potential solutions for better pain management in the future. Don't forget to check out the latest news and articles over at Labiotech.eu, and I hope wherever in the world you are, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.